Justice is supposed to be final, but what if the jury got it wrong? Tonight, we revisit a chilling case where one man was convicted, another suspect slipped into the shadows, and experts still argue about the truth decades later. Before we begin tonight's case file, kindly tell us where you're watching from in the comments. And to all my truth seekers, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss a story that makes you question everything you thought you knew. It was a cold November evening in 1985 when the jury returned with their decision. The courtroom was packed, and the air was so heavy with tension it could almost be sliced. On trial was a man named Daniel Harper, accused of murdering his neighbor in a brutal crime that had shaken the entire community. The prosecution painted Harper as a violent, jealous man, someone who had both motive and opportunity. The defense argued just as passionately that the evidence was thin, circumstantial, and riddled with doubt. When the foreman of the jury stood, silence filled the room. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Gasps broke out. Harper's wife sobbed uncontrollably, while the victim's family clutched each other in relief. But even as the gavel came down, not everyone in the room believed justice had truly been served. Harper maintained his innocence until the very end, swearing that he had been framed, that the real killer was still out there. The evidence that sealed his fate, a single bloody glove found near his home, but one that, strangely, didn't match his size. Experts later raised eyebrows. Why would the real killer leave behind something so obvious? And more importantly, why did the jury ignore the inconsistencies? As Harper was led away in handcuffs, one juror whispered privately to a reporter, "I'm not sure we got this right." And that single doubt would ignite decades of debate, investigations, and conspiracy theories that still divide experts today. But the real story wasn't in the courtroom that night. It was in the shadows of the evidence that no one wanted to talk about. In Part 2, we'll uncover the strange forensic details that may prove Harper wasn't the killer after all. The conviction of Daniel Harper might have closed the courtroom that night, but it didn't close the questions. In fact, it only opened more. The bloody glove, the so-called smoking gun of the prosecution's case, was strange from the very beginning. It was too large for Harper's hand. The DNA found on it was mixed, partial, and degraded. Experts at the time said it suggested Harper's presence, but technology in the 1980s wasn't nearly as advanced as today. In fact, the testing methods were so limited that they would later be deemed unreliable. Even more disturbing was the lack of other forensic evidence. No fingerprints, no blood spatter on Harper's clothes, no murder weapon ever found, nothing to directly tie him to the crime scene except that glove. And yet the jury believed the story. Why? Because the prosecution wove a narrative of jealousy, rage, and opportunity. Harper had argued with the victim weeks before the murder. He lived just 2 houses away. He was convenient. But as later investigators would point out, convenience doesn't equal guilt. A private investigator hired years after Harper's conviction found something chilling buried in the old police files. A set of footprints discovered in the backyard of the victim's home. The prints didn't match Harper's shoes. They were larger, heavier, suggesting someone else was there that night. Why had this evidence never been presented in court? Why did the jury never hear about it? Was it an oversight or a deliberate omission? And then there was the neighbor's testimony, a woman who claimed she saw a tall man leaving the victim's house the night of the murder. Her statement was dismissed because she couldn't be certain in the dark, but her description didn't fit Harper, it fit someone else entirely. Forensic doubts, overlooked testimony, suppressed evidence. It all painted a picture not of certainty, but of confusion that should have created reasonable doubt. But instead, Harper was condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars. Years later, when DNA technology advanced, experts began to wonder, if the glove had been tested with modern methods, what would it have revealed? By the time Daniel Harper was convicted, many believed the case was an open and shut story of neighborly rage. But the deeper you dig, the more you realize this wasn't just about evidence, it was about influence. The prosecutor who led the case, Richard Cole, was known for his aggressive style. He was a rising star in the district attorney's office, with ambitions far beyond the courtroom. A conviction in such a high-profile case would be a career maker. Behind closed doors, whispers spread that Cole had been under pressure from city officials to clean up the neighborhood and show the public he could deliver swift justice. Harper, being an ordinary delivery man with no political connections, was an easy target. Then there was the judge, stern, impatient, and unusually hostile toward Harper's defense attorney. Records show that objections from the defense were frequently overruled, while the prosecution's motions were almost always granted. To some, it looked less like a fair trial and more like a performance with a predetermined ending. And what about the police? Reports later surfaced that key detectives had ties to the victim's family. Some say they were determined to avenge the killing, even if it meant narrowing their focus on Harper alone. The most disturbing revelation came years later, when a retired officer admitted that evidence, not helpful to the prosecution, was quietly filed away. Among this evidence was a set of witness statements, people who claimed they saw a stranger in the area that night, a man who fit the description given by the dismissed neighbor. None of this ever reached the jury. To Harper's supporters, it became clear this wasn't just a case of weak evidence. It was a case shaped by ambition, pressure, and selective truth-telling. But if Harper didn't kill his neighbor, then who did? And why was the alternative so carefully buried? While Daniel Harper served his sentence, locked away and forgotten by the justice system, the streets outside still whispered about the murder. Not everyone was convinced the jury got it right. Some neighbors claimed they knew exactly who should have been sitting in that defendant's chair. His name rarely appeared in official reports, but locals remembered him well: Tony Grayson, a drifter with a violent past. Tony had lived just a few blocks from the victim and was known for his explosive temper. He'd been in and out of jail for burglary, assault, and drug possession. What made things even more suspicious was that, just days after the murder, Tony abruptly left town. Witnesses said he sold most of his belongings for cash and vanished overnight. Police reportedly questioned him briefly, but no charges were filed and the trail went cold. Years later, independent investigators uncovered more troubling details. Tony had once worked odd jobs for the victim, but the two men had fallen out after a financial dispute. Some claimed Tony threatened the victim openly, warning that he'd get what's coming. Even more startling, when DNA testing improved in the late 1990s, fragments from the bloody glove were retested. While the results couldn't clear Harper entirely, they did indicate the presence of an unknown male contributor. Not Harper, not the victim, someone else. The profile didn't match anyone in the system at the time, but it raised the question, could it have been Tony's? By the time investigators asked, Tony was gone. Some say he changed his name, others that he'd been arrested under a different identity in another state. Either way, the trail was once again buried in shadows. And yet, the strangest part of all was how quickly the authorities dismissed the possibility of his involvement. Despite his history, his proximity, and the motive, Tony's name was barely mentioned in court, almost as if someone wanted him forgotten. If Tony Grayson was truly innocent, why did he run? And if he was, why did the system work so hard to protect him? After the trial, the world moved on. The victim's family grieved, the community found closure, or at least the illusion of it, and Daniel Harper faded into the background of prison life. But one name never stopped surfacing among those who doubted the verdict: Tony Grayson. Tony's sudden disappearance after the murder wasn't just suspicious, it was calculated. Records showed that, in the week before he vanished, he emptied his bank account, sold his beat-up pickup truck, and pawned jewelry that didn't belong to him. Items eerily similar to pieces later reported missing from the victim's home. Even more telling, a private investigator tracked down an old associate of Tony's. The man admitted that Tony had confessed to a job gone wrong and bragged about how some fool took the fall. The associate thought he was bluffing until Harper's conviction hit the papers. But Tony's ties to the victim ran deeper than most realized. Hidden in court documents was a financial connection. The victim had loaned Tony money years earlier, and their relationship soured when Tony refused to pay it back. Threats escalated. One neighbor recalled hearing Tony shouting outside the victim's house just weeks before the murder, "You'll regret this." Why wasn't this explosive testimony ever presented in court? Why was the jury shielded from the possibility of an alternative suspect? As investigators pressed further, they discovered something chilling. Tony wasn't just a drifter, he had family ties to a local figure with influence in law enforcement. A relative who, according to whispers, had the power to make evidence disappear and keep Tony's name off the record. Suddenly, Harper's conviction didn't look like an accident. It looked like a cover, a convenient scapegoat sacrificed so the real suspect could vanish into thin air. But the story doesn't end with Tony's disappearance, because years later, strange reports began to surface. Sightings of a man fitting Tony's description in different states, arrest records under aliases, and one particularly disturbing rumor that Tony wasn't just on the run, he was still committing crimes in the shadows. If true, it would mean Daniel Harper wasn't just wrongfully convicted. It meant the system had unleashed a killer back into the world. For years, Daniel Harper sat behind bars, forgotten by the justice system. But out in the world, a darker story was unfolding. Tony Grayson's name might have been scrubbed from the official records, but his shadow never stopped moving. Investigators piecing together old police files began to notice a disturbing pattern. Town after town, state after state, there were reports of violent break-ins, assaults, and even unsolved homicides, all following the same chilling blueprint. In 1992, a small town in Missouri was rocked by the murder of an elderly man. The victim was found beaten, with personal items missing from the house. Witnesses reported seeing a tall man lurking in the area, someone who vanished before police could identify him. The description matched Tony. In 1996, in another state, a single mother was found strangled in her home. The case went cold, but DNA under her fingernails suggested a male suspect who was never identified. Years later, when journalists compared profiles, they noticed eerie similarities between this crime and the one Harper had been convicted of a decade earlier. The pattern became too sharp to ignore. Wherever Tony's name surfaced, even under aliases, trouble followed. And always the same signs: forced entry, stolen goods, a violent struggle, and a suspect who disappeared just before investigators closed in. The possibility became undeniable. While Harper served time for a murder he may not have committed, the real killer was free, leaving victims across the country. But here where the trail grows even darker. In 2001, investigators received an anonymous tip linking Tony to a violent gang operating out of Chicago. This group was known for silencing witnesses, intimidating communities, and keeping authorities at bay. If Tony had indeed become part of their network, it would explain why his name was protected, why evidence was suppressed, and why Harper was left to rot in prison. It wasn't just about one wrongful conviction anymore. It was about a system that knowingly allowed a predator to roam free. And then came the discovery that shook everything: a hidden file, long buried, that suggested law enforcement had known Tony was a suspect all along, but chose to look the other way. The hidden file was never meant to see the light of day. Buried in archives, misfiled under an unrelated case number, it surfaced only when an independent journalist stumbled upon it during a Freedom of Information request. Inside were notes from detectives who had originally worked the Harper case, notes that painted a damning picture. They revealed that multiple witnesses had identified Tony Grayson as suspicious in the days surrounding the murder. They revealed that shoeprint analysis excluded Harper but pointed toward a larger size, closer to Tony's. And most shocking of all, they revealed that Tony's name had been included in the early suspect listing before it was abruptly crossed out. Why? The documents hinted at external influence, meetings with community leaders, pressure to close the case quickly. Daniel Harper was easy. Tony Grayson was complicated, volatile, connected, and dangerous. And so the jury never heard his name. The prosecution never revealed his threats. The defense never got the chance to present the alternative suspect that might have changed everything. The result, a man possibly innocent of murder lost decades of his life, and a man very likely guilty of that murder and others walked free to leave destruction across state lines. Experts remain divided to this day. Some argue Harper's circumstantial ties to the case still justify suspicion. Others insist the buried evidence points to a wrongful conviction. But the haunting truth is this: justice is supposed to mean certainty, and in this case, certainty was the one thing no one ever had. Daniel Harper died in prison, still proclaiming his innocence. Tony Grayson, his trail ends in mystery. Some claim he died under an alias. Others whisper he's still out there, hiding in plain sight. What is undeniable is the question that lingers: what if the jury got it wrong? Because if they did, then justice didn't just fail Daniel Harper, it failed us all. And that concludes tonight's case file. What if the jury got it wrong? But now I want to hear from you, truth seekers. Do you believe Daniel Harper was guilty, or do you think the real killer slipped through the cracks? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them closely. If you found this story gripping, please like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another deep dive into the mysteries that still divide experts and haunt the justice system. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and never stop searching for the truth.